Welcome everyone, welcome to The Passage. My name is Johanna Rupp, your host today, and I'd like to first of all thank you for sharing your Saturday with us. It's really an incredible and very special thing that we get to have here at Book Passage, where we get to actually break bread or cookies with our authors. They cook for us even here, it's amazing. So it's very lucky that we have this, and we thank you for that opportunity. This afternoon, Book Passage is delighted to welcome Laura Zinn Fromm, an incredibly talented writer whose work has appeared in many noted periodicals, including the New York Times, Business Week, Doc.org, and the Huffington Post. Today, she is with us to talk about her book, Sweet Survival, Tales of Cooking and Coping. This is a sublime collection of memorable stories mixed with delicious, innovative recipes, but really it's all bound together with gifted prose. So please join me in a warm, warm welcome for Laura Zinn Fromm.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, my wonderful friend Julie, who probably harassed you all into showing up. And you responded to her email, please. My brother-in-law and my sister-in-law are here from Berkeley, so it's exciting to see people I'm related to. And my niece and my nephew. Sound effects. So I started writing this book in 2011. Oh, sorry, a little short. And my original plan was to write a book about my cousin, and I will get to that. And then it sort of morphed into a book of essays, and I had been writing for Huffington Post and a couple of other places about food and my obsession with food and coping sort of through food. And I ended up packaging it all into essays that have recipes attached to them. So there's 40 essays, about 80 recipes. And I'm going to read 2 or 3 essays, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. If I'm reading too quickly, somebody say sometimes I read too quickly. And then they are chocolate meringues from the book and Persian chocolate bark from the book, if you want to see what actually comes out of this book that you can eat. So the first essay I'm going to read is called Shark Cake, and it was the first essay I'd ever had published about food, and it was edited initially by the woman who ended up editing this book, who's not here, but she lives in New Jersey, and she was very helpful to me getting this book off the ground. Her name is Jessica Wolf. So this essay is called Shark Cake, when cake is simply an excuse for frosting. I've always admired Marie Antoinette, that vain, chic fashion plate, who is known as much for bringing about the French Revolution as she is for saying about the starving peasants, let them eat cake. Poor Marie probably did not say anything about cake, but like Anne Boleyn before her, she went down in history in part for being an aristocrat who lost her head because she liked the good life too much. I am not an aristocrat, but I do like the good life, and I love rich food, especially cake, a thick slice of layer cake in the summer with buttercream frosting that cleaves and covers it, a sugary primal mush dissolving slowly and languorously on the sides of your tongue. Since I have high cholesterol, as what my sister-in-law, the therapist, calls a restrained eating disorder, I don't eat all that much cake. But when I do, I either bake it or buy it as rich and fattening as I can. I created my shark cake for the cakewalk at my son's school. The cakewalk is an event that takes place every June at an end-of-year, here-comes summer party that the school euphemistically calls the fun fair. As we all know, anything called fun or fair involving children is rarely either. Last year, I was the co-chair of food at the fun fair. Of course, it rained that day, which meant I stood inside the humid cafeteria and handed out lukewarm hot dogs for 2 hours. The fathers flirted with me, and the children grabbed their hot dogs and ran. I vowed that next year I would be involved with food at a much higher level. I decided I would run the cakewalk. I asked my friend Lori, who had run the cakewalk for 1,000,000 years, if I could take it over. No, she said, but you can be my assistant. She said she was holding on to the cakewalk crown until her youngest child went to middle school, which meant I would never wear it. When spring came, Lori emailed me. We need 60 cakes. I have 40 people signed up. Find 20 more. Seaside theme. No problem. I got the email list for my son's school and sent a note to anyone who had ever spoken to me, asking for cakes with a seaside theme. That meant crabs, lobsters, fish, whales, dolphins, boats, waves, mermaids, tsunamis, mercury contaminants, whatever. Offers of cake immediately poured in. In 2 days, we had all the cakes we needed. The cake I was making was called white birthday cake. It's a layer cake divided by a thin sheet of raspberry jam and smothered with a thick layer of buttercream. The recipe came from my cooking class in New York, who called himself Mr. Salt and Mr. Butter. His cake recipe calls for, among other things, 3½ sticks of butter, a heaping tablespoon of Crisco, and a pound of confectioner's sugar. Though I don't recommend snacking on this cake before trying on last year's bathing suit. You may get so high from eating it that you'll simply tell your suit to go to hell. In keeping with the seaside theme, I decided to cover the frosting with Sather's Boogaloo Blue Sharks. 2 bags for $1, 6 sharks per bag. Who can resist a shark in summer? I bought 6 bags. Then I decided to make 2 cakes, one for the cakewalk and one for my then 10-year-old's 5th grade graduation lunch. I spent an hour mixing the ingredients and put the cakes in the oven. Then I started making the frosting. Before I knew what was happening, I had eaten half of it. I ate so much there was not enough for the cakes, so I made more. By the time I was done, I had blown through 9 sticks of butter. It's true. The timer went off. I was sweating. I took the cakes out of the oven and let them cool in the racks. Once cooled and frosted, I laid out 30 sharks so that they circled the cake, ready to go in for the kill. My shark cake was beautiful. Even my children said so. Of course, other cakes were more beautiful. Lori placed a beach blanket Barbie doll on her cake. One woman put a plastic pail and a shovel on top of hers and covered the frosting with brown sugar so it looked like sand. Another parent filled a clear plastic bowl with blue Jell-O and placed plastic cellos on top. During the cakewalk, I lost track of my cake. But that night, I found out that the child who had won the shark cake brought it home to his mother, who had been successfully battling breast cancer. We would later become friends, though I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was that she, of all people, deserved to eat cake. And the recipe is on page 141. Lots of buttercream. So I think I'm going to read 2 more essays, and one is sort of short and one is a little long. And this second one, so this I'll just tell you quickly. This collection is sort of dark and light, up and down, in and out. You know, like life is full of conflict and contrast. And so some of the essays are funny and light, you know, like the one I basically just read, and then a couple, you know, are sort of on the darker side. So now we're heading into the darker side. But bear with me. So this one's about my husband and me, and my brother-in-law is sitting here, and hopefully he'll forgive whatever family secrets I'm about to reveal. Now I just have to find the essay because I have my weird glasses on, and I will. Oh, here it is. Okay. So this essay is called Marriage is Like a Marathon, Exit Husband, Enter Shrimp. And at the end of this essay is a recipe for shrimp with cumin. So here we go. I made this dish one cold winter night when my older son and I were home alone. My younger son was out go-karting with his cousins. My husband was out too. I like to say that my husband was out with his clients or with his friends, having a few beers and a good old time. But the truth was quite a bit uglier. My husband had left, and I didn't know where he'd gone. We had a big argument after taking our older son to look at colleges on Valentine's Day weekend. Married 20 years with 2 teenage boys, a house and a dog, our days of wine and roses were behind us. Plus, my father, now dead, had been born on Valentine's Day, so the holiday had become a strangely potent brew for me. I was supposed to be feeling romantic towards my husband, but instead I was busy thinking about my dad. Coincidentally, my father and husband shared the same name, as well as a few other similarities. Both had been Eagle Scouts, lifeguards, and firstborn males. Both were the first in their families to pursue what they did professionally. Daddy came from a family of fur salesmen and became a doctor. My husband came from a family of scientists and became a banker. But whereas my husband is fundamentally sweet, my father was difficult. He had a caustic wit, and though he could be charming and funny, capable of bouts of outrageous generosity, he was not particularly kind or loving. In fact, in his worst days, he could be pretty vicious. He tried to kill himself at least twice. He lied to his psychiatrist and took his antidepressants only when it suited him. When he developed cancer, his oncologist called him the least compliant patient he'd ever had. In retrospect, it was ironic that Daddy's birthday was on Valentine's Day. Still, I loved him. So when February 14th rolls around, I usually spend more time thinking about my late father and the Valentine's Day birthday cards I used to make him out of red construction paper, handfuls of white tissues rolled up into tiny balls and glued down to make large lopsided hearts. Then I spent thinking about my husband and how much I love him, how glad I am to have married him. My husband and I go on long bike trips in the summer and take spinning classes together during the winter. We've had our difficulties, and sometimes our love reminds me of what our spinning instructor calls that old, heavy hill. The one that is hard to climb, the one that makes you sweat and curse, the one that can be exhilarating to fly down, the one that makes you say, yeah, I'm glad I did that. And yet my father still occasionally ruins my relationship with my husband, even though he's long gone. I feel his unsettling presence out there, undermining my efforts to be kind. You may shake your head in disbelief as you read on, but as I sit writing this in the Starbucks near my kids' school, my heart belongs to Daddy is playing over the speaker. Though my heart never did belong to Daddy. Did it ever? My father broke my mother's heart when he tried to kill himself the first time. After my mother left, my father remarried, and I'm sure he broke his second wife's heart when he tried to kill himself the second time. There's a good chance he broke the hearts of the women he was engaged to after he and his second wife divorced. He's most certainly broken mine. That weekend of Valentine's Day, my husband, kids, and I were down in D.C., hours from home. We'd driven 8 hours through a snowstorm to spend 2 days looking at 2 colleges in 2 cities with our 2 teenagers. Our only thought to celebrate the holiday when the hotel left us a plate of chocolate-covered strawberries and heart-shaped Our only thought to celebrate the holiday occurred when the hotel left us a plate of chocolate-covered strawberries and heart-shaped chocolates on the desk that night. After we'd said goodnight to our kids and left them alone with their laptops, my husband went down to the hotel lobby and brought us up glasses of port and Chardonnay. When he returned to the room, I was fast asleep. The next day, as he struggled to get us out of Baltimore in the dark and the snow, he cursed that he couldn't find the right highway to take us north. All the various navigation systems were failing us. My older son, with his recently minted driver's license, told him to relax. My husband's lips pursed. Don't tell me to relax, he said, and demanded an apology. No apology was forthcoming. My husband and son bickered as the snow fell. I told them both to shut up. It was my car, my rules. My husband made a sharp U-turn. It was too fast, and the road was too slick. We all gasped. I told my husband to hand over the keys to the car. He wouldn't. One thing led to another, and we didn't speak for the rest of the ride home. Next morning was no better. I decided a little armchair psychoanalysis was in order and told my husband that most of his problems were tied to his family of origin, not the family we'd made. I blamed everything on his parents. Imagine how happy he was to hear that from me. He told me he was leaving, and when I came home, he had gone. Well, I guess I don't need to make dinner tonight. In fact, I didn't have to do anything at all. I poured myself a big glass of wine and thought seriously about throwing myself on the sofa and plotting my future without a husband. I had just run over my reading glasses, and the lease in my car was up. Would I be able to afford to replace them? I could teach more and write more and try to make more money. I could try to find another husband, but did I really want to live with another middle-aged man? Sorry, all middle-aged men. My husband and I are very different. He grew up outside Philadelphia. In his family, voices were low and feelings were restrained. His father is German, and his grandparents fled Germany in '39 when his grandmother was 9 months pregnant. Unlike my high-flying parents who took us to the Caribbean and sent us to private school, my in-laws lived modestly. Both worked for universities. God knows what my future in-laws thought when my husband brought me home, the moody, aggressive journalist who lived in an apartment she couldn't afford, but still wore Ferragamo shoes and went out to the Hamptons. Then there were the multiple divorces in my family, the infidelity, the mental illness. My father, grandfather, and great-grandmother had all spent time in mental hospitals. My grandmother had stuck her head in the oven and tried to kill herself when my father was 2. Both my father and grandfather had received electric shock therapy. My father's first cousin had kidnapped a baby and gotten away with it. We'll get to that later. My father's sister had gotten divorced, so had my mother's. My stepfather had left his wife for my mother. My mother had left my father for another man and left that man for my stepfather. The sad and deviant behavior was endless. By contrast, my in-laws only knew one other couple that had been divorced, and that couple still lived in the same house. They just stopped attending weddings and bar mitzvahs together. That's all true. They're very nice people. And here I was, 20 years later, wondering if I had driven my husband away. I sipped my wine. It was cold and comforting. I checked my email. No word from my husband. I looked over at the stove. I had defrosted 2 pounds of shrimp that morning, and they were just sitting there, cold and shriveled, almost completely defrosted, waiting to be cooked. I could ignore them, put them off until tomorrow, but 2 pounds of shrimp is a lot of shrimp, and day-old shrimp is not so delicious. Plus it was pricey shrimp, $38 worth to be exact, and I was now possibly in no place to squander money. I took a deep breath, knowing that cooking would put me in a better frame of mind. The pouring, the measuring, and the reading of directions. Turn the oven on, open the olive oil, smell the cumin, turmeric, and coriander. Whatever you've been thinking of before disappears when you follow a recipe. Plus, my older son was poking around the kitchen. If I made something to eat, he might stay, keep me company, and my future might feel a little less grim. I removed shells. My son measured out spices. There are foods that send your mouth singing and your heart racing, foods that make you think, I can keep going. This dish is one of them. Coincidentally, I'd made it before for my husband when the kids were away and we had the house to ourselves. It was a hot summer night and we had grilled the shrimp and sat outside on the patio. As the sun set, we sipped our wine and toasted our solitude. That was then, this was now. The thought of cooking outside was a joke. The grill was piled high with snow. I couldn't even see the patio furniture. My son and I made the shrimp in 24 minutes. It took a grand total of 15 minutes to prepare and 9 minutes to cook. I did not sit at the table. We sat on stools at the counter and ate the shrimp off of small plates. I didn't expect anything else to happen that night. My son went back upstairs and I went up to my office. Half an hour later, my husband called. We argued and sort of settled things. I, who rarely apologized, said I had spoken out of turn. Is there anything for dinner, my husband asked? Yes, I said, there's shrimp. And I just realized that I actually made the shrimp and spilled it all over the book, which is why it's yellow with turmeric. Anyway, it's a very good, easy recipe. So the last essay, I'm just going to read part of it because it's long, and it's all about the cousin I mentioned who had sort of kidnapped a baby and gotten away with it for a long period of time. And originally the book was supposed to be this essay, expanded version, and I can tell you a little bit about what happened if you have questions after I finish reading it. So this essay is called Climbing the Family Tree, Kidnapping, Mental Illness, and Me. I might kidnap that baby. No. My niece. But that's one of my family.
You met her if we die, so.
I should be really old by then. I wouldn't know. She looks so happy. Okay, I'll get to you later. So here's the other. On one side of the family, we have this. A Nobel Prize winner, a 2-term governor, the provost at a major university, a physicist who helped develop the atom bomb, a psychiatrist and internist, some lawyers, a few art collectors, a computer programmer, 2 stockbrokers, a math teacher at Stuyvesant, a CPA, 2 architects, multiple bridge players, a trailer park developer who also owns laundromats, a banker, and 1 children's book illustrator. On the other side, we have this. Alleged incest, multiple suicide attempts, a couple of successful suicides, rampant obesity, several divorces, stints in mental hospitals, rehab facilities, county jails, and state prisons, and what seems like ubiquitous mental illness. I'm related to all of it, and mostly I have stayed away. But in the middle of my life, once my children became old enough to do homework on their own, and my husband didn't need me for much except vacation planning, sex, and staying in touch with his mother, I decided to track down my cousin Trudy, who had done one of the craziest things I'd ever heard, kidnapped a baby and got away with it. I actually hadn't thought about her at all until one sunny morning in October 2002. I was cleaning up the kitchen. My older son had just gotten on the bus for kindergarten, and my younger son was running around the family room, chewing on a sippy cup and pulling down his diaper. The phone rang. It was my mother. Cookie, do you have your New York Times in front of you? My family has assumed that women with small children just spend a lot of time sitting around reading the New York Times after they've had their morning coffee. In fact, I was reading the New York Times that morning. Yes, I said. Why? Good, she said. Go to the Metro section. See it? What am I looking at? That's your father's cousin, Trudy. I read the headline, "Woman Who Took Baby is Freed." Beneath it was a picture of my father's cousin Trudy and her husband Abe. I scanned the story quickly. Apparently Trudy had gotten out of Rikers a few weeks earlier for kidnapping her son when he was a baby. She'd gotten away with it at the time, but now, 20-some-odd years later, the authorities had caught up with her, and she and Abe had gone to jail for the crime. Trudy had pleaded guilty to first-degree custodial interference. She was 50-something and diabetic, and had been released after just 2 months through a special program for nonviolent inmates. Her husband Abe, who had pleaded guilty to second-degree kidnapping, was serving a 2 to 6 year sentence and was still in prison. As a former Business Week reporter, I was intrigued. One of my cousins was in the news. I looked at Trudy's picture. She certainly looked like she could be my father's cousin. The women in my father's family were by and large overweight. Trudy was plump and a little disheveled. She was sitting in a wheelchair staring into the sun. She was smiling, and something in her face looked kind and happy, as if a few months in prison hadn't been such a big deal. She didn't look like a woman who had spent over 20 years as a fugitive. She looked like your mom's friend from Bridge, the kind of woman who did the New York Times crossword puzzle, shopped at Loman's, and probably could give you a few tips on how to cook a brisket. "Did you know Trudy?" I asked my mom. "Of course," she said. "We knew the whole story." The story was that Trudy and Abe had adopted a baby boy. Why they couldn't have a baby of their own, my mother didn't know. All she knew was that the baby was tiny and delicious, and that Trudy and her husband had had a wonderful time caring for him. One weekend, my parents took my brother and me to a party at their house in Queens, so the family could meet the baby. The party was out in the patio, and apparently I held that little baby in my arms for a very long time. But 5 months later, the thing that every adoptive parent worries will happen happened. The baby's birth father sent word that he wanted the baby back. Curiously, the baby's mother didn't want the baby, but the court didn't care. After almost a year of litigation, a judge awarded custody of the baby to his birth father, a young man from Long Island who was studying to be a plumber. But Trudy and Abe had spent years trying to adopt, and they weren't getting that baby back so fast. So one night, they left their house and disappeared. It was like they dropped off the face of the earth, cutting off contact with everyone they knew. They stole social security numbers, changed their names, created phony birth certificates, and moved across the country to raise their baby as Nicholas. They supported themselves making and selling silver jewelry in a square in Santa Fe. Eventually, they turned themselves in, but not until Nicholas was a grown man, out of college, and looking for a job. During our phone call, I could sense my mother's usual glee that she no longer had anything to do with my father or his family. But she knew that since I was a journalist, albeit semi-retired and suburban, I would be interested that someone in our family had made the front page of a section of the New York Times. My mother is terrified of mental illness, but she knows I'm fascinated by it. I've always been drawn to the dark side of my father's family, a darkness that is frequently pitch black. I thought about calling my father to discuss this, but at that point he was getting chemotherapy for lymphoma, and I didn't want to bother him. Plus, I knew that even on his best day, my father didn't like to talk about his mostly wayward family. Maybe his family's demons reminded him of his own. I didn't really know Trudy. My parents separated shortly after Trudy and Abe disappeared, and my mother, who'd been the glue holding my father and his relatives together, stopped playing that role once she moved out of the house. Although my father supported his father and sister financially, he barely spoke to either of them or any of his relatives. He never spoke of Trudy. Of course, I never knew that Trudy had kidnapped a baby until my mother told me the story that morning in 2002. I thought the Times account was the whole story, but it wasn't. 2.5 years after Trudy got out of prison, my father died. It was May 2005. It probably said something about my relationship with my father that in the 5 years he suffered with lymphoma, I only spoke to his oncologist once, even though Dad was being treated 10 minutes from our house. I often dropped him off and picked him up, but I never once sat with him while he was getting chemo. It's not that I didn't care, we weren't close. I did and we were, but my father was a fiercely independent and difficult man who didn't like asking for help. I think of my father as someone who, for a long time, set the world on fire. That is, until his mood swings caught up with him and he decided to burn it down instead. By the time he was diagnosed with cancer in 2000, Dad had blown through 2 marriages, 2 engagements, and too many jobs to keep track of. He'd been sued by colleagues and hospitals and wives, and he sued them all right back. He lost millions in lawsuits and divorces. He tried to kill himself a couple times, one when I had just turned 2 and he was passed over for chief resident in New York Hospital, and then again 29 years later after I'd had my first baby. My brother had also recently had his first baby, and we both had boys, so Dad was a new grandfather with grandsons to brag about. Yet one great winter morning, right after Christmas, he took a large carving knife, tucked it under the passenger seat of his blue Jaguar convertible, and drove to a quarry close to his house. He plunged the knife into his chest, just missing his aorta, and survived. The first time I visited him in a mental hospital, he was sitting in blue pajamas. He'd been transferred from the trauma center of another hospital, where he'd been admitted after he'd stabbed himself in the heart. Now he was in the psych ward at the local hospital. The room was small. There was a bed with a curtain that drew closed around it. He looked at me with hope in his eyes. He had always been combative. Now he was as pliant as a child. He had no books on his bed table, no papers to sign, no x-rays to read. I told him I would bring him some books. He beamed but looked surprised. "What's wrong, Dad?" I asked. "All is love," he said. "All is love." My mind began to fill with questions I couldn't ask. Why couldn't you OD on sleeping pills like a normal person? You're a doctor. You could have written yourself a prescription. Why did you try to murder yourself like some Shakespearean tragedy with all this drama and bloodshed? Dad's pale blue eyes had always remained hidden behind thick lenses. He wasn't wearing his glasses now. They'd either been taken away or he had lost them en route to the hospital. Here were his blue eyes now, large and light. He sat at the edge of the bed. His pajamas alone terrified me. He didn't own pajamas. Dad either wore custom-made suits from Hong Kong or white tennis clothes. He looked at me expectantly, and then he started to cry. "What's the matter, Daddy?" "I don't want to be locked up." Years later, I would see the face of my sons when something would go wrong, and they would wait for me to make it right. But it was the first time I'd seen the face of my father. My father had been a brute, powerful and strong, a bull ready to charge. Who was this scared little boy in pajamas, shocked that people loved him? It took me a long time, too long, to realize that this was who he'd been all along. My father finally did die. It was a shock, even though we'd all expected it, and in my case, occasionally longed for it. Still, I was devastated when we lowered him into the ground. My father had left no instructions about how or where he wanted to be buried, so my brother and I bought him a plot in New Jersey, not realizing that Dad had been maintaining a family plot in Brooklyn that his grandfather had bought some 70 years ago. Oddly, it was Trudy who told me about that plot after we paid the funeral bill. So, 2 more pages. Do you want me to read more?
Yeah.
I feel like I've been talking for a long time. "Hi, I'm your cousin Trudy, your dad's first cousin," she wrote in an email in June 2005. Dad had been dead 2 weeks. After Dad died, Trudy had sent a condolence email to my mother, who was Dad's ex-wife of 23 years. Didn't really need much consoling. You move on. She did. He was a difficult person, Mom wrote back to Trudy. But he was the children's father, and you only get one per customer. With that, she turned Trudy over to me. When a parent dies, that's one less person in the world who loves you. You're not likely to find that kind of love again. And even if that person has taken you on a ride that was chaotic and occasionally terrifying, that ride is over now, for good. But it's hard to stop missing your parents once they're gone, as loony and unpredictable as they might have been. My desire to go on a ride with my father again, this time with a seatbelt in 2020 hindsight, is what led me into an email relationship with Trudy and ultimately a friendship with her husband Abe, the brains behind the whole kidnapping operation. I was pretty thrilled to hear from Trudy. For years I'd wondered about my father's family. Why was there so much depression? Why were there so many suicide attempts? In addition to my father and my grandmother, 2 of my first cousins had thrown themselves off the Golden Gate Bridge. Another of his cousins died of a drug overdose in Florida. One great aunt was a paranoid schizophrenic. Then there was the family business. Why did it once thrive, supporting my grandfather and his 4 siblings, turning my great-grandfather into a millionaire, and then ended up in bankruptcy proceedings? Why did my great-grandfather die without a will, leaving his children to squabble over the business and ultimately shut it down? The former Business Week reporter in me was particularly interested in this tale of corporate mismanagement and woe. "Wow," Trudy wrote me after I sent her a long list of questions about her side of the family tree. "Families are complicated things." Yeah, they are. And now here she was, the infamous cousin Trudy, a woman who'd been on the FBI's most wanted list, the one link to my father's past that I knew of, a woman who had the gumption to disappear with little more than a baby in a stroller, a woman who had defiantly lived her life as a fugitive under an assumed name, a middle-aged mom who dyed her hair and worked for cash so she could send her son to college, a woman with a college degree and an affable manner who eluded the authorities for more than 20 years so she could raise her baby in safety and peace. Here she was, crazy Cousin Trudy, criminal Cousin Trudy, lighting up my computer screen with those soothing words and good sense. The news of her kidnapped baby was all good. He'd grown up into a handsome young man with a wife, a young daughter, and his own baby boy in the way. This kidnapped baby had, I kid you not, worked as a policeman, a prison guard, and an EMS worker. He had gone to college and graduate school and now worked full-time as a fireman. And he had done all this with a fake birth certificate. He knew all about his birth family and had spent some real time with them, but he didn't speak to them much. According to Trudy, he was just fine being kidnapped. Abe and Trudy, despite being ex-cons, were great parents. They may have committed a federal crime and dodged the law for decades, but their intentions had been honorable. Trudy's first email was cheerful and chatty, and she sounded intelligent. More to the point, she sounded sane. The last time I saw all of you was 26 years ago at my house in Queens, New York, she wrote. We were celebrating the birth and pending adoption of my son, Nick. You spent the entire afternoon holding and playing with him. He was about 2 months old at the time. Unfortunately, the adoption was challenged, and after fighting in court for 10 months, we fled New York, lost contact with everyone. Trudy concluded by saying she was willing to tell me anything I wanted to know about the family. I wanted to know it all, and I especially wanted to know about her. That's it. Thank you. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. If you don't, have a cookie.
I have a question.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to write that book? Was it like an ongoing piece by piece? Or did
The book started out as the book about the kidnapping.
Right.
And so I worked pretty hard on that for about 2 years. I mean, I teach creative writing, and I was also writing about cooking and coping for Huffington Post and our local patch. So I was doing that part-time and writing this part-time. And then events unfolded, and my cousin did not want me to turn this into a book. So I turned it into an essay that was basically about me trying to write about him and her. And I packaged it with the essays that I had written for other publications, with the, sort of the theme being, cooking, coping, mental illness, eating. So all in, it was about 3 years, like 2 years of part-time effort, and then 1 year very focused effort.
I have a question.
Yes, sweetie.
At school, they all said, whenever we are talking, we raise our hands.
I think she did raise her hand.
At school.
Thank you, Jill.
Do you have a question?
Do you have another question, or was that your question?
Oh, sure.
One of the questions I have when writing memoir is there's sort of two schools of thought. One is that you can sort of fill in your own memory if there isn't fact or
Right.
transcripts. This is a ripping story, apart
Yeah.
from being a memoir. It's just really gripping. How do you feel about sort of making it a story and filling in facts from your own experience?
My friend Julie and I used to work together at Business Week, and we were basically trained, you do not fill in facts, you do not make up facts. If you want to fill in facts and make up facts, we call it short stories or novels.
Right.
So I would not, if I was going to do that, I would turn it into a novel.
Right.
But other people have different approaches to memoir writing. I just still sort of think like a journalist.
Right.
So I wouldn't. I had thought at some point of novelizing this, and I was just too fact-bound to do it, to be honest with you. And so I'm not against doing that, but it wasn't part of my training, so I don't do it.
Well, you did a fantastic job making it really gripping.
Oh, thank
based
you.
on
Thank you. Marcy.
Have your sons read it, and how do they feel about it?
We were at a book group last night in Piedmont, and someone asked me the same question. They've read parts of it, especially parts that have already been published. They read. They have mixed feelings. My younger son said to me, he's 14, he's like, I had to put it down because I didn't like what you were writing about Grandpa Steve. And, I understand that, the grandfather that they knew was a very mellowed version of the father I knew. And good for them, let them have that nice memory. And you feel differently about your grandparents than you do about your grandparents, and that's the way the world works. So, my older son, I don't know, he's busy applying to colleges this year. I don't really think he's ready, to be honest, but,
And how about your husband?
My husband read the whole thing and loved it. I will say that the essay I wrote about him was the last thing I showed him. Imagine why. And my editor kept saying, "Did you show Steve?" My husband and my father have the same name. So she's like, "Did you show Steve the essay?" And I was like, "No, not quite yet. I'm still tinkering with it." She's like, "You gotta show it to him." So, but he loved it. He actually was fine with it. So, yes.
So you're still married?
I'm sorry. Yes. People ask me that all the time. Yes, we are still married.
And where do you teach creative writing?
I teach creative writing in New York through New York Writers Workshop, and I also teach out of my dining room in New Jersey.
I love your teaching.
Oh, thank you.
It's just, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you think food will stay the trigger? And the person that always comes to mind about that is Ruth Reichel. Like, she can't write without food, but you can write without food. So when you think about what motivates you now as you're writing, does the food trigger the story, or?
I don't know. It certainly did for these 40 essays, and it still triggers me for sure especially if I make something new and it was either really good or really bad. Like, my instinct is to write about it. But I also feel the flip side of that is that it's a very saturated market, food writing. And if I want to write another book, maybe I want to write about something that's not so food reliant. But I don't know. It really is a trigger for me. And I'm obsessed with it, and I love it, and it makes me crazy. It fills the self-loathing, so it covers the gamut of all the emotions. So I don't know.
Well, you sent me Gastronomical Me years
I
ago,
did.
and I kind of feel like you've been living with that for since you've read that, and it kind of felt like it was your expression of the same thing that Anthony Fisher was expressing.
Yeah, you're right. That's my sister. Who's also a foodie.
Is there a recipe associated with that last story?
Oh, yes, there is. It's iced Mexican mocha, and it's a combination of like coffee and chocolate syrup and cayenne pepper.
Chocolate syrup. Chocolate syrup.
Chocolate
syrup.
Come here, Dylan.
You stopped reading at a certain
Chocolate
point, but
syrup.
did your
Chocolate
cousin
syrup.
Fruity answer your questions about the mental illness in the family?
She did.
In a helpful way?
She was extremely helpful. She was, I never got a chance to meet her, unfortunately. She passed away. I mean, I met her as a child, but I had this years of communication with her, and she answered every single question that I had, gloves off. And she was a very sort of intelligent, I wouldn't say normal, like who's normal, but like straightforward, direct person, and she did. So I was very, very grateful to her. And her husband was the same. I mean, he didn't know my family as well as she did, but he was also very, very nice and straightforward about everything.
I think we have time for one last question.
Well, maybe someone who
Oh.
doesn't ask a question would rather. Otherwise, I can. I have two questions.
Okay.
So did you say, what was your cousin's name again?
Trudy and Abe.
Trudy, she didn't want you to do the book in a certain way?
No, she passed away. So then she passed away several years ago, and then I was in touch with her husband. I get to this in the book, and then he became like this incredible resource for me, and I ended up spending a lot of time with him. And he really wanted the book to get written, and wanted a legacy to his son and his grandchildren. And so I was busy writing this book with him and talking to him, and it was like very exciting for both of us. And then his son really didn't want him to put it out.
Nick?
Yeah, Nick.
Okay,
I changed their names, but And so they'd already been in Good Morning America, it had been in the New York Times, it had been all over everything, when they turned themselves in. But the son really felt like he didn't want that following him around anymore. So I had to change my approach to the story. I was originally going to interview the birth parents and the judge and the lawyers and everybody, and I had to not do that.
Did you meet Nick?
I did not meet Nick. I mean, I met him when he was a tiny little baby, but no. He doesn't want,
I could understand.
yeah, I could totally understand it. I really could, you know.
Wow.
So, but his dad had originally much different views.
At what point did Nick know the story about his kidnapping?
You know, he basically knew when his parents turned themselves in. So he was probably 21, 22.
He didn't know before that they
no.
were hiding or anything? Huh.
He suspected he might be adopted because I think his hair was red and theirs was something, you know, they didn't really look alike. But he did not know about the kidnapping until they turned themselves in. They really went like way down deep under. You know, they didn't take any money with them. They didn't see their mothers for several years. They didn't talk to anybody in the family except this one cousin. And they changed their name. You know, everything was just left, abandoned. So,
Dropping their life, you know?
thank you very much.